great to see you. We've quite a few online as well. And just to welcome everybody. And Michael Hannon, our head of college for Galway and Mayo, and registrar is going to welcome us all and open this morning's symposium. So thanks, Michael.
Thank you very much, Karina, and delighted to welcome you all to this project symposium on reimagining assessment and feedback for student success. I'm also delighted to see that there are programs from each of the three colleges making up the ATU here today. This is an area that I've been talking about supporting and encouraging for many years. But as Naomi will allude to, little has changed over the past several decades. Research indicates that it takes in the region of 25 years for culture to change. So I reckon we should be seeing a change of culture at this stage within the ATU colleges, if not across the sector. Currently, we are coming to the end of our programmatic review cycle here in the Galway Mayo College, as indeed they are in Letterkenny and Donegal and Sligo. In the Galway Mayo College, we started the programmatic review when we were GMIT and hoped to have it completed before we were designated. But of course, COVID got in the way, and we all know about that. Regardless, we wanted to add greater value to the programmatic review process, and following discussions with the Academic Council, we set three high-level priority areas for consideration during programmatic review, namely assessment, sustainability, and employability. As the focus today is on assessment, the key area that I wanted programmatic review to focus on was over-assessment. It seems we can't get enough of it. I hear staff for years now complaining of their workload, mainly linked to assessment and corrections. And I'm afraid my simple answer is that you are pretty much to blame yourselves. Sorry if you don't like that, but that's my response. You designed the assessment strategy for the modules and the program. So you might want to think about that going forward. Students are also overworked in trying to meet assessment requirements. There are too many components, and many of them are of a low credit value. So students may have to make a strategic decision as to the effort required for the return involved. We then move on to a module that is co-delivered by a number of lecturers. So God help the students in that environment when everybody wants to get their stake in relation to having their own assessment component built in. In our new academic calendar for the university, we have terminal exams now scheduled for after Christmas. And to be fair to the students, they supported this change once the rationale was explained. However, some students made the point, and were supported by some staff, that the time period from when lecturing ends to when the exams are held is too long, and they may have forgotten what they have learned for the exams. Now think about that. I'm almost embarrassed to repeat that here today, as this culture threatens the core attributes and the fundamentals of higher education. We could go on about that, but I won't. So moving quickly along. It is great to see the innovation piloted in each of the three programs here today. But I worry, where do we go tomorrow or from September? And we're only talking about three programs from a very large portfolio of programs. How do we scale this innovation? How do we enable and support staff to take more risks and be more innovative? Where are we on the continuum of cultural reform and change in relation to assessment? I hope we're not at the beginning, as we cannot wait 25 years more to see transformation on assessment, and that also means that I've been talking to myself for the past 20 years or more. So to conclude the opening session, I'd like to thank Naomi for agreeing to deliver the keynote. I want to thank the 3 heads of teaching and learning who are working very well together across the new university. And I want to thank you all and everybody for engaging with this project. And I really do look forward to seeing innovation in assessment being scaled at speed across the university. I hope you have a very good conference. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Michael. And now we're delighted to have Professor Naomi Winstone. I think she's coming in live now. Is she coming up, Kevin?
Good morning.
Do I? Sorry. Sorry. Oh, I think. Yep. Yeah. Got it now. Perfect. Hi, Naomi. Lovely to see you.
Good morning.
Now, Naomi has been here a couple of times in Galway, but sorry you couldn't make it today, but big congratulations on your new baby, new arrival. So I hope everything's well with you, and hopefully you'll be back in Galway maybe next year. So delighted to have you. So Naomi is a professor of educational psychology and director of the Surrey Institute of Education. So Naomi has been working at the University of Surrey since September 2009. She's a principal fellow of the Higher Education Academy and was awarded a National Teaching Fellowship in 2016. Her work and her area of specialism is in cognition and learning and assessment and feedback. And she has done some amazing work in the UK in higher education under a number of innovative projects. So we're delighted to have you here with us, Naomi, and to hear all the great ideas you're going to share with us this morning. So thanks, Naomi.
Lovely. Thank you. And thank you for the invitation to talk to you today and to join your event virtually. So under the theme of reimagining assessment and feedback in higher education, what I want to do today is to think about what we've learned over the last couple of years, what that means for the future, and then what assessment could or should look like. And I also want to tackle head on some of the barriers, some of the challenges that we know might get in the way of assessment reform and large scale change, and how we can overcome some of those. So I'm going to start by mapping out what I see as the past, the present and the future of assessment in higher education. Think about what we've learned from the pandemic context as well. It's a really useful case study for shining a light on our thinking, on our willingness to innovate, and on what some of those barriers were that might have got in the way in the past. And then I'm going to talk about 4 areas that I think are important in the future of assessment. Making sure assessment and feedback are meaningful, learning from our experience over the past few years of the importance of compassion, collegiality, and the relational dimensions of assessment and feedback, that there are people involved in these processes. It's not just quality assurance and descriptors and devoid comments of context. I'm going to talk about the importance of disentangling assessment and feedback, quite a controversial idea, but the recognition that these 2 things don't always have to go together, and what opportunities does it open up if we separate them. And then learning focused feedback, so thinking about what we really want feedback to do and how we can make that happen. And as I said, finishing off by looking at some of those barriers and enablers to making change happen. So starting with the past, as was alluded to in that introduction, very little has changed in assessment. If we look back over 20, 30, 40 years, exams continue to be a core part of assessment diets in higher education. And in terms of coursework, we see a lot of very similar tasks, whether that's reports, essays, the kind of traditional coursework task that works in a variety of disciplines. We've also seen perhaps what we might call glimmers of innovation and creativity in assessment. So, for example, the work that's been done on programmatic assessment, getting away from those module silos that create challenges in assessment. We've also been driven, I think, by very strong views of students about some views of assessment. So group work is one of those areas that we often shy away from because students evaluate their experience negatively and express a desire for individual rather than group assessment, regardless of what the benefits of that form of assessment might be. So I think to summarise what we've seen in the past, we have a very strong tradition of exam and coursework style assessment, evidence of things changing, but in small pockets rather than on a sector-wide basis. Where we are now, I think we find ourselves in a very unique situation at this point in time. We've had to change and we've experienced assessment and feedback in ways that we never thought we would. And that leaves us with, I think, quite a difficult dilemma that I know universities across the world are grappling with. Do we go back? Do we say the pandemic is finished, it's now time to go back to the form of assessment that we had before, the model, the approaches? Do we decide to keep some of the elements from the last few years of our experience? And if we do keep those, which bits? Do we really know what is best and what from the pandemic situation has worked and has worked across contexts? It's been very difficult to evaluate the processes that we've been through because of the nature of working in a crisis response situation. So how do we know what to keep and how do we know how to push forward from the experience that we've had? For the future, we have this horizon ahead of us and an opportunity to change. And I would argue that assessment needs to change for many reasons. The nature of the workplace is changing. The way in which people work, whether that's in person, remotely, the use of technology, the way in which we engage with AI, for example, all of these things will change the nature of work. And that means that assessment needs to prepare students for that changing nature of work. We also have other concerns within higher education that I think point to a need to change the way in which we assess students. A couple of examples: grade inflation. So nationally, certainly in the UK, concerns over grade inflation. To what extent is that an artifact of the type of assessments that we've been using? To what extent does it represent the changing nature of our students? Understanding how we can assess in a robust way, but that still supports students' development, and recognising that students should improve over the course of a degree. Contract cheating is another concern. We've moved from concerns about maybe general plagiarism towards these very specific challenges, such as contract cheating and the use of essay mills. What does that tell us for assessment design? We need to perhaps do things slightly differently. So when we think about change and doing things differently, I've posed the question of how brave can we be? How brave do we want to be? And perhaps most importantly, from my perspective, how brave should we be? So we can change, we can do things differently, but what evidence do we have to drive us towards the change that is going to be effective across contexts for different students over time, and that isn't going to disadvantage some groups of students over others? So that question of bravery, yes, we can think differently and we could decide to completely reimagine the landscape of assessments in higher education, but we should also be driven by evidence, and we have that responsibility to ensure that what we do doesn't have a negative impact on our students. So moving on to learning from the pandemic, David Bowd and I published a piece in The Conversation in August 2020, so quite early in really to the changes and the challenges of the pandemic. Not that we knew we were early in at the time. I think we were probably hoping we were moving out of it. But what we did in this piece was to just argue for the importance of thinking about what we do with assessment, rather than just carrying on and moving back to where we were before. Now, this was quite a controversial piece in the end. It generated a lot of discussion and disagreement. But the main argument that we were making was that exams are very rarely a valid and authentic form of assessment. There are some cases where exams are valid and are the right way to assess students. For example, in the kind of situation where in the workplace, students are required to recall information very rapidly under pressure, then exams can be valid. But in very few professions is there a requirement to write down things from memory in a big room under timed conditions. It's not authentic as a form of assessment. And we don't argue that exams should go completely, but rather if exams are to be used, that needs to be driven by a really sound rationale. So by a design and a belief that this is the appropriate way to assess students, rather than it just being a default or a simple option that's selected for assessment. Now, I found this framework from RSA really useful in thinking about how we move forward from the pandemic. So this basically represents things that were started or that were stopped during the crisis. So in this case, during the pandemic. And then once that period has finished, what was stopped and what was started. And what I think is really important for us to focus on is not the things that we've ended, not the things that we've let go, or not the things that we've restarted, but the things that we have the opportunity to amplify. So things we were able to try with the relaxed constraints during the pandemic, and what we might be able to take forward, because there's some kind of promise, and that leads us to new practice, that leads us to change and to thinking differently about assessment. So what can we amplify? These are, I think, where we can find the clues to the future of assessment. Now, I want to give the voice to the students first of all, and in spring 2021 at our university, we did a project with a group of students where we asked them to imagine the future of assessment and feedback within higher education. And we worked through various activities with them to encourage them to think through what this might look like, but also to tell us what their experiences have been and what they wanted us as institutional leaders to learn from their experiences. So I'll share a few of their insights with you now. The students were really clear in saying that having experienced different forms of assessment, they really didn't want to be taking some form of assessment that was basically testing their memory rather than their understanding or creativity or problem solving, for example. So we did a lot of open book 24-hour tests and exams, and students saw a real benefit to these in comparison to a timed, short-timed exam in an exam hall that was closed book. So they liked the opportunity to use the resources that they had curated in preparation for these exams in that time to answer or solve problems that they'd been set. They felt that was a better way of them demonstrating their ability rather than their capacity to remember facts and figures. But some of the challenges they brought up around these forms of assessment, a really valid point they raised, that if we're going to give them 24-hour window to complete a task with all of their resources available to them, why are we setting it with a 24-hour window? Why is it not just a piece of coursework that they complete with the resources available to them and then submit at a particular point in time? And I thought that was a really important point that they raised. Are we doing it just so we're keeping some kind of test or exam on the assessment diet, rather than thinking about how students can best complete that particular task? The 24-hour window also created other challenges in that we had a lot of students saying that they really felt the pressure to spend a full 24 hours on the assessment, even though we told them that the expectation was they would maybe spend 2 hours or 3 hours within that window. They felt they had to use all of the time available to them. And so some students were staying up for a 24-hour period to spend all of that time working on the assessment, which really wasn't good for their well-being, and certainly didn't represent the expectations of what they would do in that task. A lot of students experienced authentic assessment for the very first time during the pandemic. Excuse me. So one of the things that we encourage staff to do in redesigning their assessments was to think about what students might do with their knowledge in the workplace, in professional practice. And so we saw a lot of really creative tasks being set for students. And students said they really liked this for two reasons. One is it really built their confidence in terms of what they could do and how that would relate to their future work. So they felt they were having the opportunity to demonstrate that they had learned relevant things that would help them in the workplace, and that really raised their confidence. But there was also a really interesting effect on their identity. So students reported that by doing these kinds of authentic assessment tasks, and I'll come back to this in a minute, they really felt they were developing the identity as a professional in that area of work. So they felt they were able to sort of test drive that professional experience, and that really helped develop their sense of identity. In terms of feedback, what students really liked and wanted to perhaps to amplify were more flexible opportunities to discuss feedback. So previously, in person, they would perhaps be able to drop into office hours to discuss their feedback with a member of staff. That was challenging for some students, perhaps, who lived a long way from campus, who had caring responsibilities, and depending on when those office hours were set, might have to make a journey into campus specifically to wait in line to speak to somebody about their feedback. But what happened during the pandemic were really brief Teams calls where students could just spend a couple of minutes with a member of staff on Teams, raising queries and getting answers. And students said they found that flexibility really, really valuable. And finally, in terms of feedback modes, a lot more use of audio and video feedback was made during the pandemic. Despite us trying to support this development over many years, suddenly the way in which we became much more confident with using the technology meant that there was a lot more willingness to use audio video feedback, and students really liked that. They liked the personal element of it. And another thing that was done really well was the use of feedback webinars. So when a piece of work had been assessed and marked, there would be a webinar for students to join. The academic would provide a brief summary of what was done well, what some of the common mistakes or errors were, and then students had the opportunity to ask questions, and all students saw each other's questions and heard the responses to each other's questions. So it was a really inclusive way of engaging students and staff in dialogue once feedback had been returned. So I think there's some really important lessons for us to take forward there. So moving on towards my view of what the future should involve in terms of assessment and feedback, I'm not going to talk specifically about the types of tasks that can be used, because I think that is so discipline specific. Instead, these are some general principles that I think should guide our thinking and our willingness to change assessment within higher education. So starting with meaningful assessment and feedback. Authentic assessment, I think, is something that is incredibly important for us to think about as we move forwards. When we're designing tasks and opportunities for students to learn through assessment, thinking about what they will do in the future and how this assessment will support their future work is incredibly important. Now, obviously, this is much easier in some disciplines than others, where students are specifically training for a particular profession in their higher education course. Some courses are more generic and students could go into many different professions. So it then becomes a little bit harder to set authentic assessments, but still something that's absolutely possible, and I'll share a resource in a minute that really does speak to the different disciplinary perspectives. But first of all, I wanted to share with you this paper, which is one of the most cited papers on authentic assessment. And in this paper, they highlight 3 features of authentic assessment, what makes an authentic assessment. The first is realism, and there are 2 ways in which realism can be achieved within assessment. The first is in terms of the context of the task. So the context, the nature of the task in some way represents an example from real life. So this could be, for example, using a case or a case study from a real life context, a real life problem to solve. Now, this element of realism in terms of the context is really important because it does mean that in a traditional exam type assessment, we can make those questions authentic if they draw from a case analysis or problem solving task from a real life context. The other dimension of realism is I think what we most commonly think of as authentic assessment, which is a task that represents the activities done by a professional in that discipline. So it might involve the production of a report. It might involve some kind of creation of materials, for example, something that a professional in that discipline would do. And we set the students that as an assessment task. Cognitive challenge is a really important feature of authentic assessment. So they argue that many tasks that are created in the workplace require higher order cognitive skills. They require problem solving, decision making, and the application of knowledge to a new situation or a new task. So a key feature of authentic assessment is that it doesn't require simply the reproduction of knowledge. It requires the application of knowledge or the capacity to use what's been learned to solve a new problem. And finally, evaluative judgment. So evaluative judgment represents the ability to understand the standards and criteria being used to assess work and to be able to make those judgments for yourself, to be able to look at your own work or your own performance and be able to judge its effectiveness and how it relates to standards and criteria. Now, assessment that is authentic should help students to develop their evaluative judgment, to really hone their capacity to know what good work looks like, for a very important reason that we need to develop within students the lifelong ability to assess and regulate their performance. That's something they're really going to need in their future. And so assessment within higher education should support students to be able to do that. So these 3 key features, I think, help us to design authentic assessment tasks, ensuring that they align with these 3 pillars and these 3 principles. I've talked a lot about the importance of evidence and knowing that what we do is supported by evidence. And authentic assessment does have a lot of really good quality evidence to support its effectiveness. This systematic review, which was published in 2021, represents 2 key themes really within the benefits and the advantages of authentic assessment. The first relates to the learning experience. So students tend to demonstrate much stronger engagement with assessment tasks that possess features of authenticity. And that is manifested in things like their enjoyment of the task, but also the effort that they expend on completing the task. Students also report stronger satisfaction for tasks that are authentic. They find them more enjoyable, feel they're more beneficial, and it's much less of a hoop to jump through than some more traditional forms of assessment. The second theme relates to employability skills, and here we see the benefits in terms of preparing students for their future working lives. And some of the advantages that research demonstrates include communication and collaboration. So working with others, having to present information in different ways. These kinds of things support key skills that students will need for the future. Then we see evidence of benefits in terms of those higher order thinking skills that are often targeted by authentic assessment. So problem solving, decision making, and applying knowledge to practice. And then there are benefits also in terms of employability, much more on a personal level. So studies demonstrate that authentic assessment is really effective in developing students' self-awareness and their capacity to reflect, but also their self-confidence. And that was certainly something that was shown by the students in the work that we did at our university. So some really key benefits to authentic assessment that are supported by evidence. Now, many of you may have already come across the work of Kay Sample and Sally Brown, who did a fantastic job during the pandemic of providing resources and guidance to support the redesign of assessment that was required. And this work has continued, and they are continually collating case studies of authentic assessment across disciplines and across countries. So if you haven't seen this resource already, I would strongly recommend it, having a browse of the case studies, because there are some really great examples of how people have changed their assessments and tried to move them towards tasks with greater authenticity. So that's authentic assessment, but I think we equally importantly need to think about authentic feedback, so that feedback isn't simply written comments on students' work, but that we think creatively about how we can prepare students for the workplace through the way in which they experience feedback in higher education. So Phil Dawson led a team to think about authentic feedback, moving beyond the ideas of authentic assessment and applying them within the domain of feedback. And so they came up with 5 characteristics or pillars really that represent authentic feedback, many of which are similar and show overlap to those domains of authentic assessment. The first here again is realism. That what we should do when engaging students within feedback processes is think about what those feedback processes look like within the workplace. So is it the case that feedback tends to be delivered in person? Can we think about the setting in which feedback is usually shared, the format, the style of feedback, and try and replicate that within the higher education programme? A really key example is within healthcare education, where when students are out in practice, they will be receiving feedback verbally in the moment on the ward. They won't be opening it on a computer necessarily or reading written comments. It will be in the moment and it will be verbal. So can we try and recreate that in the way in which we provide feedback within the higher education programme? Again, cognitive challenge is a feature, and what Dawson and colleagues argue is that the way in which feedback is used and applied within the workplace requires higher order thinking, some of these abilities to apply feedback, for example. So one of the ways in which this can be achieved within feedback is either commenting on the more abstract features of the work, or perhaps commenting on just a section of the work and then requiring students to extrapolate those comments to the rest of the work that they've done, sort of testing that ability for them to apply feedback rather than simply read and absorb it on a surface level. Effective challenge. So they argue that we shouldn't shield students from emotion in receiving and responding to feedback, because they are going to have challenging feedback exchanges in the workplace, and it's going to elicit emotions. So instead, we need to give students the opportunity to practice managing emotions and to give them the skills to be able to use those emotions in a productive way to support their future development. Evaluative judgment comes up again as a feature of authentic feedback, because we can use feedback to help to develop and hone our capacity to judge the quality of our performance. And the more we give students the opportunity to really engage with feedback and use that to inform their evaluative judgment, the better they will be able to use and generate their own feedback to support future work. And finally, enactment of feedback. So they argue that it's a key expectation in the workplace that feedback is used, and that we can evidence that feedback has been used. And if we think about annual appraisals, for example, that's an ongoing cycle, and there is an expectation that people talk about how they've used feedback from the previous year's appraisal and how that has been enacted through that year. So we need to do the same thing within higher education. We need to build in opportunities for students to demonstrate the products of their engagement with feedback, where we ask them to tell us how they've used feedback, to reflect upon their experiences of using feedback, for example, and give them tasks, follow-up tasks, where they can put that feedback into practice and demonstrate that they've used it effectively. So moving from meaningful assessment and feedback to relational dimensions of assessment and feedback, there's a huge literature on the importance of relationships, on emotions, all of these features within assessment and feedback. And I'm not going to go into those in detail today, but I do just want to talk about particularly what we take forward from our pandemic experience and how we can build much stronger communities, both in terms of staff and students within assessment and feedback. So one of the experiences that I certainly felt from the pandemic was how well we were able to connect and work together and feel that sense of connection when we didn't see each other for such a long period of time. And I think because we had to respond very quickly to a challenge that nobody had anticipated and that nobody had experienced before, we pulled together in a way that I certainly haven't experienced within my professional life so far. We made allowances for each other and for our students. We recognised people's workloads and burdens and challenges that they were experiencing in their personal lives. And we recognised people's contributions and really valued what people were able to bring. And I think we understood our students in a way that we hadn't had the opportunity to before. We had a window into their home lives, their personal lives, how they were being able to manage such a difficult period of time. And I think that helped us to really understand them in a new way. Now, that ethos, that environment, I think is something we definitely need to keep, that level of understanding, that sense of collegiality, and the way in which we were able to just pull together and manage a really difficult situation. A lot of people are starting to talk about the affordances of the experience that we've been through, how challenging it's been, but what it means for the future. And this paper, which is in a sort of health medical education context, talks about the TINA opportunity. There is no alternative. And the way in which we can use this as the catalyst to change and enhance assessment. We've been given this opportunity. And in particular in this paper, what I really like is they talk about relational dimensions and the importance of what we take forward. And in this sense, they talk about communication, flexibility, compassion, and collegiality. Communication within assessment has always been really important, particularly to students, the way in which we share assessment tasks and we share with them what they are required to do. And that's really important from an inclusive education perspective. But what we had to do, particularly in terms of communication during the pandemic, was to explain our reasoning really clearly and really carefully, because changes were being made all the time. And these changes needed to be communicated to students, but in a really transparent way so that they understood the reasoning behind the decisions that had been made. Now, that's not specific to the pandemic. That reasoning should be conveyed to students all the time, the why, the when, and the how of assessment, so that they understand not only what they're being asked to do, but why. What is our rationale for choosing a particular task? What skills are we hoping it's going to develop for them? And sharing that should become practice as normal. Flexibility. So what I found fascinating during the pandemic was the way suddenly we were allowed to do things we'd never been allowed to do before. And the computer didn't have to say no. We were able to change things really quickly. We didn't have to go through the really long chains of quality assurance that had been in place before. So it showed that flexibility is possible. And that's something that I think we really need to take forward. Also, picking up on another point from the introduction to the symposium today, around over-assessment. So one of the things that we found people suddenly able to do was to say, I don't need 6 units of assessment. I can just have 1, and I can address all my learning outcomes with that assessment, with appropriate formative tasks to support students in preparation for that piece of assessment. So we can strip back assessment, and that is an option, and that's something we can take forward. Compassion, I think, is a really important one, and this was something that really shone through my experience, was just, as I said, that awareness of the burden on people, and the way in which assessment really contributes to anxiety, and to have an influence on well-being. But also in the way in which we work together, suddenly it felt like systems were not so adversarial or hierarchical as they had been before. There was a real sense of everybody being in it together. And so that led to some really amazing conversations around assessment that hadn't really had the opportunity to take place before. And finally, collegiality. The way in which people work together was absolutely exceptional. And that's something that, as an ethos around assessment, really should be taken forward, to think about how we work together. Not only staff, but also staff with students, and co-designing some of those elements that we've seen, I think are really important for the future of assessment. So moving on to disentangling assessment and feedback. Now, back in 2019, when I visited the Centre for Research and Assessment and Digital Learning at Deakin in Melbourne, had a wonderful conversation one day that came out just out of the blue, really, about this notion that assessment and feedback always happen together. Now, we see it in our descriptions of practice. Assessment and feedback is just a term that we use to describe a selection of activities. But I also once heard a professor of education saying that they only ever use the term assessment feedback because there is no feedback without assessment. And I find that quite problematic, and I think it drives our thinking in particular ways, because these things don't have to go together, and it opens up all sorts of opportunities if we start to think about how we could separate them. So we talk about the challenge of assessment strangling the learning function of feedback. Feedback could be something completely different and something so much better if it wasn't constrained by a lot of the factors that drive assessment practice. And so we need to reposition feedback as more than an afterthought. It's something that is important for learning in its own right. It's not just something that happens after students have been assessed. So this is what we argue in the paper. Excuse me. There are a series of problems that we argue are created by this entanglement of assessment and feedback. We often see that students have a really strong grade focus. So depending on what their grade is, it will determine whether or not they even open the feedback file. But also it will colour their engagement with feedback, how they process those comments and what they choose to do with them. And that is because feedback comes alongside a formal assessment, and that colours engagement with feedback. Because feedback comments often accompany an assessment and a grade, often we see that comments on a piece of work tend to have the flavour of grade justification. There's that need to cover our backs in terms of the grade that we've given so that it's defensible, and so our comments tend to do that work rather than driving future learning. Feedback information often comes too late to be of use, and that's a real challenge because assessment, for very good reasons, has to go through all these stages of quality assurance in terms of marking, second marking, sometimes being seen by external examiner, being ratified by an exam board in some cases. And what that means is that by the time the work is returned to the student with those feedback comments, those comments are pretty useless because they've moved on. It's far too late for those comments to really change students' thinking or behaviour. Feedback naturally becomes an afterthought in course design. We tend to design our assessment strategy and have to document our assessment strategy, but it's much less common for us to document our feedback strategy and to think about where we're embedding feedback opportunities within a course, and how we're expecting students to use that feedback to support their learning. We argue that forms of documenting feedback can impair its quality. So because of the formality of assessment and the way in which it needs to be defensible, it means that feedback is often produced as an artifact. So feedback forms, for example, where we use a particular template or pro forma, and that really constrains the natural dialogue that is feedback. And it means we need to produce an artifact rather than having a conversation that would perhaps support students' learning in the future. And finally, anonymous grading. So there are very important reasons why work should be graded anonymously, but that has a real knock-on impact on feedback. And research suggests that students find feedback much less useful when work has been marked anonymously, and they also feel much less of a relationship with the person who's marked their work. It feels much more divorced of that relational context. And then we propose some things that could be done to preserve the learning function of feedback, such as the adaptive release of grades. So where students' feedback is given to them first and they do something with that feedback before the grade is released, trying to separate the assessment from the feedback. Students eliciting feedback information. So rather than teachers providing comments that end up having the flavour of grade justification, students can request via interactive cover sheets, for example, what they would particularly like feedback on, and then we're able to respond, and it really does start that dialogue. If we don't have to give feedback at the end of a unit of assessment, could we perhaps use those comments at another point in the cycle where they're going to have the biggest impact? Now, that could be if students submit a draft, we give them detailed comments on the draft so that they can directly use that to inform the final piece. And then the final piece of work is perhaps graded up against a rubric, but not accompanied by detailed feedback comments for reasons I've described, where they're less likely to be useful. Designing for implementation of feedback information. So when we're designing our assessment strategy, thinking about where we can put in feedback and where we can ensure that feedback can be used. So is that a follow-up task? Is it a two-part task? Or is it signposting students to transfer to other modules or units where they can use that information? Separating anonymous grading from personalised feedback. So just because work is graded anonymously doesn't mean that that feedback needs to be anonymous. We can perhaps unblind the work before providing comments so that we can comment on students' development, for example, and how they are progressing from a piece of work to the next. Or we can have verbal conversations after that work has been returned where the feedback really is personal, an opportunity for students to ask questions and seek clarification. And finally, fostering ongoing curation of feedback. So we talk about the importance of feedback supporting students' learning in a way that is completely separate from the assessment that they might be doing. We want them to see trends and patterns in feedback from lots of different people, rather than just seeing feedback as comments that relate to that particular assessment. So portfolios can be particularly useful in this regard. So finally, moving on to learning focused feedback. Now, in the book that David Carlos and I published in 2019, we talk about this shift from an old paradigm to a new paradigm. The old paradigm of feedback really representing this transmission of comments. It's focused on what teachers do, not what students do. Whereas the new paradigm is all about what students do. It's about their engagement with feedback and how they use that to inform their learning. And we argue that we can make this shift towards this student-focused paradigm just by rethinking the way in which we do things. So turnaround time is a really common part of assessment policies, having to return comments to students within a particular window. The challenge with this is that we can meet that turnaround time in every single instance, but that feedback never be timed in a way that enables students to use it to inform ongoing work or what they do next. So rather than thinking about the return of comments in terms of this fixed window, thinking about it in terms of how and when students will be able to use that information to support something else they do. Moving away from thinking about detailed comments and commenting on every element of a student's work towards providing actionable comments, the kinds of comments that represent a call to action so that students know that there is something they can go away and do with that information rather than just receiving a really detailed commentary on what they have or haven't done. We move away from educators being the sole person who can provide feedback towards students seeking feedback from educators, from peers, but also generating feedback for themselves. And a really key trend in the literature at the moment is about the importance of inner feedback, where students compare their work to an exemplar or something they've done previously, and through that process generate inner feedback for themselves, which is a much more sustainable approach to feedback. Moving away from thinking about making sure that feedback is presented in a consistent way across modules to thinking about how learning can be connected across modules. How can feedback be transferred from one module or unit to another one so that we don't have feedback sitting in these module silos where students don't see it as having utility? And finally, moving away from a focus on student satisfaction as the marker of the quality of feedback towards the impact of feedback on students' learning. So being able to show that feedback is actually having an impact and it's changing students' thinking or confidence or motivation. And using that as the marker of the quality of feedback rather than just whether students are happy with it. So that's the kinds of shifts that I think we can make. What this requires, if we're going to position students in this way within feedback processes, is a way of developing the skills that they need to play this role. And in a systematic review that we did on students' use of feedback, their engagement with feedback, we came up with 4 key recipient skills, the things that you need to be able to do if you're going to use feedback effectively. You need self-appraisal to be able to understand your strengths and weaknesses and to be able to apply that understanding to evaluation of your own work and strategies. You need assessment literacy, so the ability to understand standards and criteria and apply those to your own work, but also to understand what good work looks like. Because if you don't know what good work looks like, it's very difficult to use feedback to help you get there. Goal setting and self-regulation. So you need to be able to set yourself targets for how you're going to improve through the use of feedback and monitor your progress towards meeting those targets, perhaps changing your strategies if you're finding that what you thought was going to help you to apply that feedback is not working so well. And finally, engagement and motivation. So using feedback is hard work and it takes hard work. And so we need to be willing to put in the time and expend the effort if we want to be able to reap the benefits of using feedback. Now, these skills informed the development of a toolkit that we put together to help students develop these skills through sharing strategies and tips with each other in a feedback guide, by enabling educators to run workshops and allocate curriculum time to helping students develop these skills and practice them and receive feedback on their use of feedback, and through curating feedback in a feedback portfolio so that students can start to understand and appraise their overall development and strengths and weaknesses rather than treating each individual piece of feedback on its own. And the toolkit is freely available to download, and everything's downloadable as Word files, so it can be freely edited to fit a particular context. That approach to developing feedback literacy is very much a sort of generic, almost add-on approach that is done alongside the traditional curriculum. We've also started to think about how we can embed these things within the curriculum, and that if we want to help students develop the capacity to use feedback effectively, we should do so within the context of their discipline and what they will be doing in the future, in a similar way to the authentic feedback idea that we talked about earlier. So we talked about the ways in which feedback is employed within the disciplines and the content of particular programs that can help us to develop these skills while students are learning about disciplinary content. So I'll just talk you through a couple of these ideas from the paper. So the first theme that we came up with was responding to task briefs and client requirements. So in a lot of disciplines, such as architecture, design-based disciplines, when students are in the workplace, they will have to respond to a brief from a client, and when they've presented an initial design, they will receive feedback from the client and have to amend their design in light of that. So can we, when we're talking to students about how they do that and how they will do that in their professional lives, let them learn about how to effectively respond and how to effectively use feedback. Promoting behaviour change, another one I'll pick up on. So in lots of disciplines, particularly in healthcare, students will learn about strategies and techniques for promoting behaviour change. And this is a really good opportunity to talk to them about the importance of using feedback, because if they are providing feedback to a patient or a client about their behaviour change, if that person does not take the feedback on board, they're not going to reach the goals that they're being set to improve their health, for example. So again, there's a disciplinary element of using feedback within that discipline that we can use to support the development of students' feedback literacy. We don't need to separate development of recipient skills and feedback literacy from their learning of disciplinary content. In fact, it will be much more meaningful if we embed this understanding within the discipline. Now, this is the learning focused feedback approach we've embedded at our university, which takes us away from thinking about the common part of assessment, what I call here the assessment phase, where we assess and mark work. That's just one tiny part of the assessment and feedback cycle. There's a bit that comes before where we help students prepare for the task and to learn through their preparation for the task. And there's also a really important consolidation phase where we support students learning after their work has been assessed. And we've set out a series of principles that help guide our practice through this assessment feedback cycle, all the time thinking about students' learning, sorry. So in that preparation phase, it's about clear and inclusive communication of the task and giving students the opportunity to understand and discuss the criteria. So developing their evaluative judgment, developing their assessment literacy. In terms of the actual assessment phase, we're putting focus on timely feedback that's enabling students to use it for something they do in the future, and those actionable comments, the forward-looking comments that give students the opportunity to develop and hone their skills. And then finally, after that assessment has taken place, we want to help students use feedback by giving the feedback comments a landing place. And this means making sure there's somewhere for students to directly apply those comments. Now, it could be a follow-up task quite quickly, or it could be a task that they're doing the following year of their programme, but where those comments are particularly relevant. If we can signpost that landing place, students know that there's somewhere for them to use those comments and that we expect them to do so. And then also providing opportunities for dialogue. We should be enabling students to talk about feedback. And as we've seen from the pandemic, there are creative ways of being able to do that. So I just want to finish by reflecting on the environment, the context, and how we support change, and some of the challenges we might experience there. So I've written about risk aversion in the context of enhancement and development and innovation within higher education. And we see risk aversion as a real problem because we're heavily regulated, student satisfaction metrics, all of these kinds of things can actually work against the kind of risk taking that really promotes innovation in assessment. And the status quo bias is also a really strong influence, where if we're faced with a decision between either perhaps keeping an assessment task we've used in the past or developing a new approach to assessment, we tend to stick with what we know and what is safe. And that is a really strong bias in human decision making that plays out within innovation within higher education. The way in which we interact with colleagues is also really important. The risky shift occurs where we're more likely to be willing to take risks if it's something we talked about and discussed with others, because then it feels like a shared rather than an individual endeavour. So that can actually promote innovation if we're talking about it with others, and it's seen as something that's shared. But social contagion is also a problem. So if there's a really strong discussion or belief around certain forms of innovation perhaps being devalued, that gets picked up by others and it then becomes a much stronger view. So that can actually inhibit innovation. And culture is really important as well, the kind of working environment. So if innovation and experimentation is seen as the norm, it won't be seen as so risky. But security is also important, job security, in having the confidence to experiment and not feeling like there are going to be negative consequences. I also thought I'd share this paper with you because specifically around diversifying assessment and some of the things that can get in the way and also support diversification of assessment. So perhaps unsurprisingly, barriers to diversification, lack of time. We often find that one annual cycle, academic year is over and we have very little time in terms of meeting quality assurance targets and processes to be able to change in time for the next academic year. Lack of resource, and that comes up with time and capacity to be able to make those changes. Fear of grade inflation, which is something I've talked about as a key driver of thinking around assessment. And lack of examples from one's own discipline that really support us to think about what we could do. And then conversely, the enablers are having the time and the resource to be able to think about and change assessment, but also having those examples to really help people think in concrete terms about what they could do. And that's where resources such as Sally Brown's website, I think, are so important in giving people ideas and showing what is possible. So I talked about bravery and what bravery offers as an opportunity. We can do things differently. We can think differently about assessment, but I think there are perhaps three key principles that I take away from what I've been thinking about. One is not just innovating for the sake of it. An innovative assessment task, a different way of doing feedback, is not valuable unless we've really thought about the rationale for doing that. So our design thinking through design, the principles of what we're trying to achieve is really important. Partnering with students is also really important. Students have a lot to tell us about their experiences of assessment, and they also have lots of ideas about how they could be assessed. And that's a really valuable resource that we could use in terms of co-designing and building those relationships. And finally, compassion is the one word that really sticks with me, because assessment, we know, is anxiety provoking. We know it's a real burden on academic time. So there are lots of wellbeing concerns around assessment. If we can hold on to those feelings of compassion and think through how we can enact assessment and feedback using compassion, then I think that's where we're really going to see change that is valued by students, but that is also achievable for our staff. So I will stop there. I'd just like to acknowledge the research assistants who've supported the research that I've talked about. I'm very happy to answer any questions. I can't hear you.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can. Yes, thank you.
Okay, sorry, I muted the wrong one. Thanks very much, Naomi. So many questions, but I'll put it to the floor first of all and see, do we have questions online, Kevin, that are coming through? Okay, do you want to call them out first? Thanks.
I will, yeah. Naomi, hopefully you can hear me okay.
Yes, thank you. Yeah.
Okay. So there's a question here from Ruth. Well, first of all, they said you're an excellent speaker. So
thank you.
Yeah. And then next is there any consideration for feedback consideration across a term/year/course so that student can see their ability and apply the feedback?
Yeah, I think that's incredibly important, and that's where things like feedback portfolios come into play in enabling students to synthesize and curate feedback. So in some cases, we can support them with that. If we're able to work with them on an ongoing basis, we can help to scaffold those conversations. But sometimes we don't. Sometimes we'll just be involved in one little unit of assessment, and then we won't necessarily see those students again. So something like a feedback portfolio can enable them to do that tracking. But there's also a really important role for personal tutors or academic advisors as well, I think, in having those conversations where we talk with students about feedback and help them to chart their progress, but also really understand what it is they need to do in order to improve further.
Perfect, thank you very much. And a second question here from online before we come to the room was, thanks Naomi, that was excellent. Have you any advice on avoiding feedback becoming grade justification while still leaving the student feeling like the grade is fair and accurate?
Yeah, so in terms of the students feeling the grade is fair and accurate, I think rubrics are really useful here because that can be a form of feedback in itself. We can meet the grade justification target by highlighting a rubric and showing which criteria and which bands apply to their work. That then leaves our written comments or our verbal comments to be much more focused on development. And I think if we can make those comments actionable, so there can be something for students to do with each of those comments, that naturally gets away from grade justification because it's focused on doing something rather than a narrative or a description of what it is they have achieved. So using rubrics to meet that transparency agenda, but then focusing our feedback on actions and improvement.
Perfect, thank you. We might just switch to the room to see if there's any questions. So 2 seconds, Naomi.
Yeah. Is there questions on the floor?
Anyone with a question?
Yeah, Mary, you might have to come to the mic. Yeah, I have a couple of questions as well, but. Thanks, Mary.
Thanks very much, Naomi. Just, I suppose, interesting. I was very interested in what you were talking about disentangling assessment and feedback. And I suppose we get mixed messages from our students about the high stakes versus the low stakes, you know, and the whole idea of over assessment. And sometimes I'm not too sure about that word because it's more workload maybe. So I was just wondering if you had any advice for that kind of engagement with the formative type assessments that aren't summative in nature, but that might lead up to a higher stakes assessment from a practice point of view.
Yeah, so I think, again, that's a really useful way of thinking about how feedback can support preparation for a task rather than feedback only being something that happens after a task. So I suppose one example of how this can be achieved pretty well is with a patchwork assessment or a patchwork text, where students are set sort of multiple formative tasks, and then somehow they can weave that together to support their final piece. So it might be that there's lots of individual questions or sections that they can do short patches of text, receive feedback on those as formative tasks, but then they can use elements of those tasks that they've completed along with our feedback to complete their final piece. So that assessment draws upon multiple pieces of feedback, giving students the opportunity to learn and to practice elements of what they're going to produce for that final task. So I think, yeah, patchwork assessment is quite a nice example of how that can be achieved.
Perfect, thank you, Naomi. Thanks for the question. There's one good question here online from Siobhan. Great presentation. Should we have a consistent approach to feedback across programs? How do we persuade colleagues to engage? Academic autonomy can be a barrier to this at times. So,
yeah, I think my view on consistency is, rather than having very prescriptive guidelines or formats or things that need to be met, to have a set of common principles, and those principles might be around actionable comments, not overloading students with comments, those kinds of things that can be enacted in different ways, so that individuals still have that agency and still believe that they can practice feedback in the way that they want to. But then there are some core principles that are being adhered to across the programme to ensure that consistency for students. One of the biggest challenges, I think, from students in perceiving a lack of consistency is where they can get lots and lots of feedback from one person and then a normal amount of feedback from somebody else, but that feels like they're not getting as much. And actually, students can be overwhelmed by too much feedback. There's evidence to suggest that if they receive too many comments, it can actually shut them off and they don't engage with the information. So having just some kind of general expectation around the amount of feedback can be really useful as well, so that you're not getting these big mismatches between different people.
Thank you, Naomi. We have a question here in the room.
Hi, Naomi. Lovely presentation. Thank you very much. And I hope the baby is sleeping for you at night time. That wasn't the question, by the way. What I want to know is, when you're giving feedback to students, do you find that you have to sort of put feedback in glittering, flashing letters for them to realize that it's feedback? Because I find with some of my students that I survey them at the end of the semester and I say, did you find the feedback useful? And one of the options is, I didn't receive feedback. Now, in fairness, they always receive feedback, but some of them, not many, but some of them will say, I didn't receive feedback.
Yeah, so there are two things I can say in response to that. I think one thing that's part of developing students' feedback literacy and their capacity to understand feedback is for them to understand that feedback comes in lots of different forms, and for them to identify feedback that's happening in the classroom when we're talking to them, that we're providing feedback. So helping them to recognise different examples of feedback is really important. The other one is really highlighted by the questions or the statements that you mentioned there, and that's the use of the word received. So many evaluation items, including those on a national level, use that language and say, ask students to evaluate what they've received. And I think that primes them to think about very narrow examples of feedback. Perhaps that's which comes on a template, an official form. Instead, I think if we can ask them to evaluate the opportunities they've had to seek, to generate, to use, to understand feedback, it's getting them to think more broadly about the different things that happen during a programme of study, rather than just those formal feedback comments that are received. So I think that is a challenge in itself.
Thank you, Naomi. Yeah, we have another question here in the room.
Hi, Naomi. My name is Rachel. I really enjoyed your presentation. Thanks very much. Some great tips there. I was writing furiously. The question I have is, or the comment and question, I suppose, is, so actionable feedback is very valuable for students, but it's hugely time consuming for us staff, putting that together. So I'm just wondering, have you come across anything in your research or your studies about, having it not automated, but some, like, if, let's say I correct a lot of maths things and people make the same types of mistakes. So I try and keep a little kind of, what would you call it, a file of comments that I kind of just keep in a Word document. But I need to try and formalize that, and obviously if we could automate it or use, technology to help us with that, we could still provide that valuable feedback whilst, reducing down the time or providing more valuable feedback to more people with the same time, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with you. And I think one of the really good things that we can do in terms of providing actionable feedback is directing students to a resource. So we can say, but let's say citation and referencing, there are errors in your citations. Rather than correcting that, or telling them what's wrong, saying, follow this link, have a look at this guide, go back and correct them. Now, that is a really actionable piece of feedback that just requires us to have a link ready to a website or a resource. And I would imagine that with things like maths, for example, there are resources or things that students could go to practice particular elements of procedure or things that help them to understand where they've gone wrong. So yeah, if we can direct them to resources and give them links and things in our comments, that is naturally promoting an action that hopefully they'll go and follow that and work through some of the correction in their own time.
Great. Thanks very much, Naomi. And I just have a couple of questions. Some have been crossed over by colleagues online and here, but just around the area of academic integrity and the challenges during COVID. And as we emerge from COVID, and yes, there's lots of really great, authentic ideas that are being brought forward that we're certainly implementing in our assessment strategies, but we have this big elephant in the room. And, you know, you probably know Phil Dawson, we had him here a couple of weeks ago online giving us a talk all around the scary world of eating, as we're all aware of. And I just thought, how in your own university in Surrey did you manage that whole space of eating and academic integrity, you know, and obviously students were very happy to be doing open book exams and all of those wonderful ideas during COVID, and how you're managing it, and I suppose what's the strategy in your university going forward in relation to that?
Yeah, I mean, it is a massive challenge, and I can give some examples from yeah, as you say, from our university, but I'm glad you've had the leading experts on assessment integrity talking to you. So one of the things that we recognise is that we need to re-educate students on academic integrity. So it was no good giving students an open book exam and saying, you know, you've had your training on academic integrity already, because the issues were very different, and we needed them to understand what academic integrity meant in the context of a different assessment task, and what a lack of academic integrity meant. So that's one of the things that we did. One of the things that I've certainly heard discussed more recently is why we don't allow collaboration in assessment, because if we allowed collaboration, it takes away one element of cheating, because we allow what we would call collusion in an assessment, and actually that collaboration is really authentic, that's how people do tasks in the real world. When we were advising people in designing their assessments, we gave them one key principle, which was to make sure that the task requires something that is the student's intellectual fingerprint. So something unique, whether it's drawing upon their own experience or something that they've been given individually to look at. So there's something unique that means an essay mill can't do that for them, and also they can't get that from somebody else. It's difficult to do. It is really challenging. So I think it needs to be the combination of education for students, and just thinking about why we need to put the constraints in place that can lead to cheating.
Yeah, no, really good. Thanks, Naomi. And I just have, did you say there was another person? Oh, no, sorry. I just have one other question before we finish off. We implemented this year, Naomi, a programmatic review framework. And one of the themes within that framework was, well, we had three themes: assessment transformation, education for sustainability, and employability. And so there's been lots of innovation and learnings as a result of COVID. And one, I suppose, the three areas of the message around assessment transformation, and you might feel maybe there's something missing, or maybe you might add to this. We felt, you know, the need to push for innovative assessment, authentic assessment. Obviously, the second part would be around feedback practices and in designing and engaging students, even the design of those feedback practices possibly. And because I know that comes through from your Delft, you know, the toolkit that you've developed as well. And self and peer assessment opportunities, where have we provided that within? So And I suppose within the authentic piece, we would feel that the work-related element, you know, is there a work-based learning element? What's making it unique? And then I suppose in the assessment task, as you said, when they get to demonstrate something that is unique to that work-based learning challenge or environment that they've been placed in, but also very much so technology-enhanced learning and digitally enhanced assessment is key. And I suppose, how would you feel we're on the right track there, or perhaps are we missing something?
I don't think so. That sounds pretty comprehensive. I think, you know, the self and peer assessment is something that I think is really broad, and there's probably some important sub-themes within there. As I mentioned, this David Nichols' work around inner feedback is really gaining traction, and I think that really has opportunity to maximise the impact of assessment and feedback whilst essentially reducing teacher workload a little bit. So I think that's sort of a win-win. So it's not just about assessing your work, but actually developing the capacity to generate inner feedback and those kinds of feedback processes and bringing them to the surface. So I think that's a really important one. The only other one I would say is about inclusivity, because I think that's a really important sort of theme within assessment. Joanna Tai has just published some more papers coming out of her project that she did on inclusivity. So yeah, her work might be of benefit there.
Yeah, and certainly there's a very strong UDL theme
yes.
in the work that we do. So that goes without saying. So thanks very much, Naomi.